I know how it feels to feel like you're fooling everybody, like you're too much and not enough, all at the same time. It's a lonely place to be, but I want you to know that you're not alone, that this mind game can stop, that there's no one like you or me, and that's where your power lives. That's what makes you genuinely great. That's what makes you the real deal. And this is The Real Deal with Bre Clark.
It has a name, the imposter phenomenon, or as most of us know it, the imposter syndrome. And to explain it, I sat down with Angela Kerrigan. As a therapist and second-generation Korean American, she explains her journey to help people know they are worthy, full stop. Her approach to therapy comes from a social justice and anti-racism lens, with an emphasis on boosting self-esteem and combating those feelings of imposter syndrome.
I am so glad that you made this big trip to come here to be on The Real Deal and talk to me about all things imposter syndrome.
I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So I want to just dive right in.
Yep, let's do it.
Imposter phenomenon. Some people say imposter syndrome. Some people say the imposter phenomenon. Some people say these imposter feelings. Break that down for me. What is the syndrome to begin with?
So all those three terms kind of refer to the same thing, really. They're pretty interchangeable, but in a nutshell, imposter syndrome refers to a group of thought patterns that lead to certain beliefs. For example, that you're inadequate, that you're unworthy, that you are an imposter, right? Hence the term. And which also lead to certain behaviors that look like avoidance, perfectionism, and overachieving to the point of burning yourself to the ground.
And a lot of us think this is a new thing, but this has been around since 78 when they first did the study.
Right. So this is definitely not a new phenomenon. I'm sure it's existed since the beginning of time in some way, shape, or form. It was only until the 70s, there were two psychologists, Dr. Clancy and Dr. Imes, who did a study with women in high-achieving positions in colleges, in the professional spheres. They studied women who felt fraudulent. These were women working against cultural norms of that time. So it's no surprise that they were feeling inadequate in a lot of ways, even though there was no actual proof that they were any less competent than their male peers.
Yeah. And so this isn't a medical diagnosis, because I think people are like, wait, what is this? Is it like depression or anxiety? Unpack that for me.
So it's definitely not a clinical diagnosis, but it can be related to diagnoses such as anxiety or depression. There are overlaps, especially between anxiety and imposter syndrome. Things like feeling a lot of self-doubt or excessive worry or a fear of something bad happening, even though it's not rooted in reality. However, the difference lies in that imposter syndrome comes up in really specific scenarios, and anxiety can be looked at as more of a general phenomenon. And imposter syndrome also kind of informs the way that we feel about ourselves in that specific circumstance.
Yeah. Well, as I have been reading up on this, there are 5 types, because I didn't even know that as well. I thought, okay, well, imposter syndrome, you feel like a fraud, but there's more to it than that. There are 5 types. Can you dive into that for me?
Yes, there are 5 archetypes coined by psychologist Dr. Valerie Young. There's the soloist, the perfectionist, the superhuman or superhero, the expert, and the natural genius. You don't have to fit into one of those categories. You can be a blended combination of 2 or more.
Yeah. As I was reading on this and looking through it, I even noticed that I fit quite a few of those as well. I think I probably would be a mixture between the perfectionist and the superwoman, thinking that I can do all the things. But as I read into this even more, I don't think there's ever been many people that I've met that aren't impacted by this phenomenon in a certain way. My background is in journalism. I know that my field is high performing, all the time. But there were a lot of times where I met people who were dealing with these feelings of, everybody's going to find out, that I'm this person, especially if they were dealing with some other type of mental disorder like anxiety or depression, which you do find a lot of that in my field. So tell me, how did you first dive into the phenomenon and shaping your work around that?
So, as a therapist and as a second generation Korean American, I'm a child of immigrants, and my Asian American identity is very important to me, and it also informs the way that I work with other Asian American clients. I've found that imposter syndrome really affects these clients in ways that are very unique to them that we don't talk about, really. We can look at frameworks of imposter syndrome, like the 5 archetypes, for example. But I feel that what's missing from the conversation a lot of times is the racial identity piece and how that impacts our experience of imposter syndrome.
As we've looked at it, studies have shown that Asian Americans, they experience this a lot more than their peers who were dealing with the imposter phenomenon. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. Can you explain some of those to us?
So the way that I tend to think about this is there's 2 components as to why Asian Americans might be experiencing so much more imposter syndrome than their peers. There's the cultural component, and then there's the racial component. And in the cultural side of things, I can speak to the Korean experience that there's a really high value placed on being humble. You're expected to be humble and not really be too proud about your accomplishments. But at the same time, the dilemma is you are expected to strive for achievement. So you're achieving. And as you're growing up, you're not really getting to practice that confidence muscle. I refer to confidence as a muscle because it's a skill that needs to be practiced like anything else. So we need to practice that. And if you're not in the habit of having this positive self-talk about yourself, I did great, I'm so proud of what I did, I feel good about myself, that's not the internal voice that you're gonna have as an adult. So that's one piece of that. As far as the racial piece of this, there's that perception that we are foreigners, doesn't matter if we were born here, speak the same language as everyone else, which is perpetuated by, I think, the model minority myth.
What's the model minority myth?
The model minority myth says that we are model citizens, right? What does that mean? We're high achieving, we're financially stable people, we are able to attain success because we have a good work ethic. We're also law-abiding citizens. We're very obedient and we're polite. So this is a very model image of what we're stereotyped as. And unfortunately, a lot of Asian Americans do internalize this concept and they believe that they have to live up to that standard.
Okay. Well, so I don't know if you know much about my background. So I've been a lot of times I've been the only Black in a lot of the spaces that I've been in. But in high school, I got a chance to, for the first time in my life, be in an atmosphere where there were a lot of Hispanics, there were a lot of whites, there were a lot of Blacks, and there was a lot of Asians. And I had a lot of friends who expressed feeling like, I don't feel like people know who I am. They all just expect me to make good grades and just be the star of my class. And I'm always studying and I'm having a hard time finding where I fit in or where my individual identity lies, which was the gist of most of our conversations. And I remember thinking through that and thinking how much pressure that must be to feel that way at all times. And when we're talking about the imposter phenomenon, we're talking about how culture, the pressures that they put on you can have you feeling like you have to show up in a certain way to get respect or be worthy. And I know that that's something that you talk about a lot with their clients is knowing their worth. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely so much pressure to be a certain way. And you can achieve all you want and be perceived as someone that's successful, but we so rarely see Asian men and women in places of leadership. And that's part of the issue too, that lack of representation. So as a child, you don't see that representation, those role models that look like you in pop culture, but also in adulthood, you don't see that in your workplace, in leadership. The other reason why we might feel a lot of pressure to achieve is because most Asian Americans are first and second generation, which means that either our parents have immigrated here or we have. As a child of immigrants or immigrants ourselves, there's this pressure to do well, There's that very valid anxiety and fear that tells us if you don't succeed, all of this sacrifice will have been for nothing.
Wow. Wow. So the pressure to not only represent yourself, but a whole social group.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow. I want to know about your story as a second generation Korean. How was that for you?
So growing up, I was one of the few Asian kids in my school. And one of my earliest memories of feeling like a fraud, like I didn't belong or that I wasn't good enough, was when probably I was 5 or 6 years old. And it's really interesting that I can still remember this because I was such a shy kid and I didn't say much in class. I didn't speak out. I didn't participate like the other kids. And my teacher at the time was concerned that I didn't speak English, even though I was fluent. I mean, I was born and raised here. And so that was a concern that was raised. And I believe that was the first time I realized, wow, I am different. I look different. And so you're treated as a foreigner and you learn that very early on.
That someone had low expectations about your capabilities that you very clearly possessed at 5 years old.
Yeah. Or that I don't belong here. Someone's going to find me out. And, I'm just a fraud. I'm not good enough. I have to prove myself.
Wow. How did that show up as you continued on through life?
So as I got older, middle school, high school, I was doing all the things that all the other kids do. But, I was experiencing a bit of anxiety. That's just a part of who I am. I've always had a little bit of anxiety, and that wasn't really recognized when I was an adolescent. So because I wasn't academically achieving the way that my teachers expected, they assumed that maybe I had ADHD. They didn't explore the possibility that I had all these feelings going on. So there was a short period of time I was on ADHD medication, which made my anxiety worse, but my grades went up. So everyone around me who had my best interests at heart were really happy that I was doing better. And I think when we talk about mental health, we have to talk about all the complexities and the different components of what goes into a diagnosis. For me at that time, what was most important was that academic achievement.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you had these feelings that no one was really recognizing because I guess they didn't have the knowledge of how deep these things could go. But that just, from what I'm hearing, continued to fuel those imposter feelings for you. Tell me, what could have been done differently? Even now, when we're unpacking how imposter feelings can be contributed from outside forces.
Yeah. I mean, it's all related, right? My first feeling of being inadequate or like a fraud when I was 5 or 6 years old probably contributed to my feelings of anxiety as I tried to perform and do well as I got older. But at the time, we didn't have the language to talk about these things. I knew what I was feeling, but I couldn't really express what I was feeling. So I think everyone at that time, they were doing the best that they could with what they knew. So it was really nobody's fault. It was all just a real learning experience for me and a journey of growth as I came into adulthood.
Okay. What tools do you think we have now? Now that we know a little bit more, now that we're starting to finally dive deep and do studies. I mean, here in UT, they're doing a study on the impact that the imposter phenomenon has on minority students or people of color within the universities because they're seeing how much it impacts their ability to be successful because it's just gone unhinged for so many years. Right. What tools do you think that we have now, or do we have the tools we need now?
Yeah, I definitely think that we can expand this conversation even more and have more research around this issue as it relates to people of color. But right now, there are several things that we can do. The one thing I always like to tell my clients is to do everything you can to not isolate yourself. You want to surround yourself with the right people, which means people who share your values, perhaps even your identity, people who are really going to uplift you and support you and challenge your self-doubt thoughts. And talking about it really helps you to recognize how maybe sometimes outrageous or extreme some of those thoughts are, and it helps to shift your perspective.
Yeah. I love that you said surround yourself with people, because I think as minorities, we already feel like we're alone. There's no one else around that understands or looks like me. And we've talked about how just being in that space, it's a little hard to advocate for yourself. Tell me how you've worked to kind of help clients understand what it looks like to navigate that space.
Well, the first thing you have to do is give people the language to be able to explain what it is that they're feeling. And with that language, you can destigmatize the issue altogether. I think the problem is that we're so scared to look outward for help because we really do think that we're alone in it. But what's really interesting is that in the earlier studies with Dr. Clancy and Dr. Imes is that they looked at how group therapy was effective for treating imposter syndrome because people came together and they shared stories that they could all relate to. And, isolation is the opposite of what you want.
Yeah, that's kind of the whole premise of the show. It's just putting awareness on this is a thing. This is something that a lot of people are dealing with, and you aren't alone in this. And all of those feelings that you're feeling, they're just these loud lies that your brain is creating from fear or childhood experiences or the outside world around you, putting that pressure there. So as you continue to do this work with your clients and just helping them understand their worth, because that's what I love most about your work is helping them understand their worth, because I really do believe the imposter syndrome is just us not recognizing what our worth is, and that we have worth beyond what we do or who we are when it comes to our profession and those types of things. What are some of the things that you hear your clients say from the beginning when they're first going through this to when you've given them the tools that they need to move forward?
Yeah. I would say when clients first reach out to me to seek help, they believe that they have anxiety or depression, and it's never really that straightforward. There are many layers to that. So once we start uncovering what's really going on, initially what they'll say is, I feel like no matter how much I achieve, I don't feel like I've achieved anything. I don't feel like I'm good enough. Or that they feel stuck, like there's a feeling of stuckness and depressed mood sometimes because they're trying to chase something that feels impossible for them to achieve.
Yeah. Moving that bar further and further as they continue. Exactly. I know that in the original study, that is something that they noticed with the women, is that they were constantly trying to achieve a goal, that they just kept moving that marker, that finish line further and further, not just to prove something to themselves, but to the people around them. That high of achievement was short-lived. So what is it that you hear them say once they've moved past some of those things?
Yeah. After some work together, they get to a place where they're able to recognize that inner critic, that voice as someone else's voice that they've internalized. A lot of times the self-critical thoughts that we're having, where we didn't come up with that ourselves. It might be that kindergarten teacher I had. It might be a parent who may have over-criticized at one point. So whoever's voice that is, it's really important to identify that so you can start in moving away from that and detaching yourself from those thoughts. With clients who feel like they've been able to manage imposter syndrome better, they say that they're able to see that thought as just a thought instead of something that defines them.
Wow. Instead of something that defines them.
Right.
Wow. I think it's also interesting that when they come into your office, it's I'm depressed or I'm anxious. And for them, that's not necessarily the case. How can the imposter phenomenon show up as that for people?
It can look like anxiety because you have a belief about yourself. Say, for example, I'm inadequate or I'm not good enough. That's going to support the thought of self-doubt, self-criticism, maybe even overestimating other people's capabilities. And then that's going to support, again, your belief that I'm not good enough, I'm inadequate. So it's a cyclical sort of a sequence that happens. So with anxiety, what that looks like is if you believe that you're not good enough, you're going to either go into a paralysis state where you don't know where to begin on a task, you procrastinate, or you become a perfectionist about it and you completely become obsessed and overachieve and go way above and beyond what's expected of you. That sort of thing over time will cause burnout. So this is how it emulates anxiety, but it's not exactly anxiety.
Wow. Well, I've talked to some other people that as they try and fulfill this purpose or this journey or this mission, when there are these roadblocks that come through, and sometimes instead of feeling like a fraud, feel like a failure. And I think for them, it's hard for them to at first realize that that's actually a pressure that was put on them and that they are experiencing the phenomenon. How can you speak to that?
Yeah. If you feel like a failure, my question would be, by whose standards? Why do you feel like a failure? And is it the failure that's causing you to feel depressed mood and loneliness because you feel very alone in that? People who feel like a failure are not going to share that with people because of shame and embarrassment. So that's how it can really kind of look like depression sometimes.
How do we navigate that? Or how have you been able to navigate that, not only in your practice, but you actually experiencing some of these things for yourself?
One of the biggest things that's changed my mindset is to ask myself if I would say that to a friend. If I hear a self-critical thought, I say it out loud or I write it down and I ask, would I say that to a friend? Because typically we're nicer to our friends than we are to ourselves. We're such huge critics of ourselves. So that's a good starting point. Another thing that's really helped me change my mindset is use a lot more and statements rather than or. So replacing your ors with ands. For example, I might fail this exam. And that's true. It's a possibility, but expand that space and allow for other thoughts and feelings and possibilities to come through and look at it in a more curious way rather than judgmental way. So shifting from I might fail this exam to I might fail this exam and I might also succeed. Right? So replacing ors with ands, holding space for both possibilities.
Well, we've talked to some other guests, and one of them has been able to shape their imposter syndrome into positivity for themselves. And for some people, that might look like the complete opposite of the imposter phenomenon, but it's actually a tool that they've created for themselves to move forward. I like that you show how powerful that can be.
And I think that's really great, saying positive affirmations. But if going from complete negative to complete positivity doesn't feel authentic to you, you can really just kind of recognize, this is what we talk about when we talk about self-compassion, is recognize where you're at and acknowledge that, oh yeah, I am feeling pretty crappy today and I'll get through this day, right? So it doesn't have to be a complete 180 if that doesn't feel true to you.
Yeah.
But definitely positive self-talk can help.
Yeah, I love that. That's amazing. Has that been something that you've used a lot during your time of trying to navigate from someone saying that you don't belong to, no, I do belong, I do have worth, and I am worthy no matter what, happens today?
Yeah, I think it's about taking baby steps. There are times that still I feel like I don't belong completely, and I just kind of take a more curious approach to that instead of trying to feel a certain way about it. So what that looks like is just really recognizing, okay, I don't feel like I belong. There are definitely times, even still today as an adult, after all the self-work I've done, that I don't feel like I belong. Sometimes I'm afraid that someone's going to find me out, that I'm not good enough. And in those times, it's okay to recognize that, okay, I don't feel like I belong here. Maybe I don't feel like good enough right now. But that's a feeling, and that feeling is not necessarily a fact. That feeling just gives us information, and it helps us to figure out what to do next.
Yeah. Take that next right step.
Yeah.
Wow. I love that. What is your hope for the future as you move forward in your practice. I think you've done great work. And I wouldn't be surprised if we don't have a book from you one day on that. No pressure, though. There's no pressure coming from me for that. But I just love your why in all of this.
My hope for the future is that more Asian Americans, and I'm speaking to the Asian experience, is that they will be able to ask for help without the shame and the embarrassment attached to the idea of seeking help. I also think that in being able to ask for help and show up as our true authentic selves, we're breaking down that model minority myth and no longer perpetuating that model image. That's impossible to uphold.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of people can take what you're saying, not just Asian Americans, but see how we can move forward in that way. We've been talking about authenticity a lot when it comes to the antidote to the imposter phenomenon and moving forward past that if you show up as your authentic self, and know that that's what you're doing and you're worthy in that, then it will help fight some of those thoughts of, man, I'm a fraud. I'm not what people think I am.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's difficult to understand what is your authentic self. A lot of people don't know what that means. So you have to consider what are the different ways that I've been influenced by other people's opinions, influenced by societal standards and expectations. Who was I before I became influenced by all of these things? So I think that might be a good starting point to start thinking about, who am I authentically?
Yeah, I think it's funny that you say that, because even in my work, it's hard to figure out what your authentic self is, because you have a lot of people who think that you're just putting on this performance, and other people who say, oh, I loved, when you did that, and you think, well, that wasn't necessarily my authentic self. For me, when it comes with my voice, the moment the cameras would come on with me on the anchor desk, it was me being who I was, but there was just a certain difference. I was sitting in the chair. And for some people, they would say, you know what, that's not you at all. You're just, you're completely fake. And I noticed that defined my experience every time. And I went from this confident person who knew I knew what I was doing to, can I do this? Am I really a journalist? Do I know what I'm doing? Even with all of my years of experience. And so I love that we're having this conversation and diving into all these different aspects of the imposter phenomenon, because I don't think it's just this, oh, you need to, feel better about yourself and not be, have all the self-doubt. It's much deeper than that.
It's a journey.
Yeah, it's definitely a journey. Yeah. Well, I'm so thankful for the work that you do. I thank you for just bringing all your expertise and helping us unpack this. And Angela Kerrigan, you are definitely the real deal. And thank you for helping us all be the real deal.
Thank you for having me.